Welcome to the Radical Intimacies podcast series by Memefest. I'm Oliver Vodeb, a sociologist looking closely at design and communication, co-founder of Memefest, and editor and curator of the Radical Intimacies, Designing Non-Extractive Relationalities book. In this podcast, I will be in conversation with the authors who contributed to the book, many of whom I've known for years as collaborators and friends. The book was published in 2023 by independent academic publisher Intellect. The book explores resistance to capitalist domination through design, focusing on dialogue, power, land, interventions, and radical praxis. It presents the concept of radical intimacies, a relational way of designing that fosters closeness and decolonizes knowledge and the public sphere. In this series, we'll dive into these ideas, discussing and expanding them, and creating spaces for deep, meaningful exchange in the undercurrents. Let's see what happens. Welcome to our third Radical Intimacies Memefest podcast series. I'm very happy to announce our next conversation, which I had with Patricio Dávila, who is a designer and artist, researcher and educator based in Toronto with Chilean and Canadian background. Patricio has contributed a amazing chapter to our Radical Intimacies book, in which he looks into the potentials of critical visualization practice in the case of an experimental visualization essayistic documentary that makes the case for NATO accountability in the death of refugees in the Mediterranean Sea. I found our conversation very inspiring. It was a beautiful conversation, and what we discussed was exactly what Patricio names critical visualization, which is a term describing, certain practices that deal critical design communication practices, which deal with data and information, but in a particular manner. I find that actually what was revealed through the conversation is that we are actually somehow opening up a new research field. So, but a few words about Patricio. Patricio is a designer, an artist, a researcher, and educator based in Toronto, Canada. He is an academic at the Cinema and Media Arts Department at York University. He is also a member of Public Visualization Lab and Studio, and he focuses his research largely on data visualization as assemblages of subjectivation and power. So I welcome you to our third episode. I wish you a pleasant listening, and I see you soon.
It's great to see you, and I'm very excited that we will talk today. I was in the last days again. I was going through your chapter, designing facts, and I find it fascinating in how precisely and very very articulate you were basically looking at. What you call critical visualization. And, that's a big term in your work, in this work. And I would like to talk about this more, but just as a little bit of an intro, you've been looking at a particular case study that deals with something that is highly relevant, I think globally, but, it's happening here in the Mediterranean. So you were looking at the refugee crisis and how, you know, the big institutions like NATO are neglecting, their, what they're here for. And, we are witnessing this ongoing humanitarian catastrophe that doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon.
Yeah.
And what you have been researching or are researching is ways to, this is how I understand it, is ways to use techniques that are somehow related to documentation, but you're expanding that.
Yeah.
And these ways of dealing with these ways of using design are meant to help counter this neglect of human life.
Yeah.
I wanted to, we will come back to this inevitably to this term, but can you please, tell me a bit about critical visualization as an intro? It's this big concept, how you see it, what is it, where does it come from in your mind?
Right. So yeah, I've been looking forward to this chat for a while now, and I really appreciate your contextualization of that project, because in the chapter I look at not my work. I kind of do a case study of the work of forensic architecture,
Yeah.
specifically to researchers in that outfit, um, who create a dashboard, who create a visualization that tries to tell the story and show the different components that make up this crisis. And for me, I felt it was a really good example of critical visualization because the term critical visualization, I've been going around and around. And so someone who I've worked with as well, I don't know if he came up with it first or if I came up with it first, but I think he came up with it first. I'll give him that to Peter Hall, who
Right.
had written about it quite a few years ago. But I think in typical form is like, I thought about it, but he wrote about it first, right?
Yeah.
So it's
So
one of those
you were
things.
first, you were first basically.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so there was a kind of zeitgeist maybe around it.
Yeah.
But for me, the notion of critical visualization is necessary because visualization I was seeing was a kind of use of data and the representation of data where the only thing that was really important within the orthodoxy of the design of information representation
Yes.
was a truthfulness to the data.
Yeah.
And it was modeled around this notion of mathematical communication theory, right?
Yes.
Signal
Yeah.
to noise ratio.
Yes.
And so that visualization, the value or the success of a visualization was based on how little noise there was and how immediate you made the data to the human viewer, the human user.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of different disciplines, fields that are employed and techniques that are employed in order to make that. So whether it is the paring down of visual artifacts so that they're highly that they're highly polished and very
Yeah.
reduced to their bare minimum, right?
Yeah.
Can you see the resonances with certain design
Of
trajectories,
course I can.
right? Um,
Yes.
and another one is the use of interaction, right? And computers to enhance the voyage one would take in exploring a data set. And visualization was also, and still is, interested in looking at providing a shape of the data, right? So once you
Yeah.
put all this data together, what can the visual apparatus of a human quickly pick up, right?
Yeah.
That's like that's the golden maybe golden rule or golden goal. I don't know how you might term it, but the apex of visualization is to aid human cognition. So for me, that is laudable. That's great
Yeah.
within certain parameters, within a certain sphere. Sure.
Sure.
How do we make a better machine? How do we make a better gadget, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But for me, what was missing is why, how, context. How does this work? And so criticality for me was taking on sort of notions of critical theory from Frankfurt School onwards to be suspect of these types of cultural productions, right? Because I saw them as cultural productions, not just scientific instruments for representing complex data,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so part of critical theory is to look at the social context and the relationships between media, people, economy, politics, society, and then further on around gender, around race, around class, like all of these different things that
Yeah.
might come to frame how visualization works.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at criticality as this particular form of taking apart what the visualization is from its components, what leads to making that visualization, and then how does that visualization circulate. And in my work, I've been heavily influenced through assemblage theory
Yes.
and through actor network theory or material semiotics. So this form of looking at multiple agents, multiple actants, and how we focus on the relationality of all these actors.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And especially within a Latourian or Bruno Latour version of actor network, that
Yeah.
there are humans and non-humans involved in this
Yeah.
very complex arrangement that makes
Yeah.
something possible. So that for me was my contribution to look at design practice as far as the representation of information or data is concerned
Yeah.
through this kind of relational work,
Yeah.
so that we don't just fetishize the object that can be nicely reduced into an annual of
Yes.
design projects, so it looks so nice in a thumbnail or
Yeah.
just in a glossy magazine. It's like, oh, this is such a beautiful chart, such a beautiful map. And
Yeah.
there's much more before
Yeah.
and after that artifact. Right?
Yeah. Thank you. That's wonderful. Like this particular approach is very, very close to my heart. I as you might see in the work that I do as well, it's heavily relational and tries to go beyond the artifact. We both have similar influence, although you have a much stronger influence from Bruno Latour than I have. So, and this, I find beautiful, very interesting. But certainly, we both use theories, ideas from the Frankfurt School, so we are very close, and that's very exciting because the world is small and big, but it's not that often that such overlaps happen really. So
it's very exciting to find somebody else where we share a language and there's like a
yes,
short form. It's like, oh,
yes,
this, and this. And I was like, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I was
that's
like,
right.
oh my God, where have
That's
you been
right.
all my life?
That's right. That's right. It's beautiful. It's beautiful that this happens. So we both know that the term critical design is something that's established within the design discipline. It comes from an Anglo-Saxon, point. It has been established comes from England, and has claimed this new thing. Like we are doing. We figured it out. We paired critical theory with design and put it into a gallery and and call it critical design. So again, I will say it's an Anglo-Saxon perspective, especially, in English, which I think neglects many other manifestations of overlappings of, let's say, ideas that are coming from the Frankfurt School or are close to that have a Marxist influence or a psychoanalytical influence. So Russia, Soviet Union had a lot of this work, Eastern Europe had a lot of this work, but it wasn't, I guess, as vocal, or the general design discipline didn't didn't promote it, wasn't interested in it, as much as what comes from England.
Yeah.
That's just a little bit of a context, but I'm curious. I really like critical visualization. There's something about the word visualization that is not the same as design. Can we, without now fighting about millimeters, in the theory or whatever, but like, I find it interesting, how do you see the difference between critical visualization, since, this is what you come up with, and critical design, which is something that you knew about? How is that different?
The critical design that I was first introduced to was the kind of Dun&Bradstreet form of critical design, which I saw as provocations, as this not overly theorized.
That's right.
It kind of provocative, and basically trying to undo the utility value, right, of design, which in itself is interesting. It's useful, and at that point it was something that I sort of was attracted to. And there's other forms of critical design, whether it's emphatically labeled that or not, from Holland, obviously, from the Netherlands, and Metahaven comes to mind. Jan van Toorn comes to mind. Although there are other things that were attached to that in terms of exercises in branding, or work in investigative forms of design, right? Or journalistic forms of design, which I find very interesting. And I think that kind of work is more related to the critical visualization because of the use of information, the research involved, and the work of representing data as a form of information in something that can be acted upon or aid analysis. And
Right.
so in that sense, that's where the critical design to critical visualization works. So visualization is, if nothing else, a form of design. So cartography, map making is a form of design. It's absolutely a form of design. What we call design is just making something, right?
Sure.
Designing something, assembling information into a visual artifact, right? For communication or for use. So that is a not necessarily a market purpose. It doesn't necessarily have a market purpose, right? It can be used for as a form of knowledge production. It can be used to control workers. It can be used to control or to map out consumer habits and all these other things, right? But it's not necessarily that, right? And it seems like, and other people have done work like this, but advertising and branding seem to be particularly focused on that and kind of came out of that, right? And so mapping, for instance, has been used in order to understand the territory, and has been used in colonization, of course, right? Command and control. But there are these aspects of visualization that are used in science, in biology, in geology, geography. So of how to understand a particular thing. So that for me was key. How it outstrips critical design as maybe how it started out. Maybe people have kind of changed the meaning and expanded it more recently, but how it started out was, for me, critical visualization needed to attend to the relations, the the associations of different actors. So I
Yes.
mentioned human and non-human, but a key part of that doesn't mean that human and non-humans are just like a pencil and a person has the same value. Not at all. It's more like in terms of agency within a network, the pencil could be very
Yes.
strong instrument that affects how something is done
Yeah.
as much as a person would.
Yeah.
But for me, there's an ethics of
Yeah.
how we treat the humans in that equation,
Yeah.
in that network.
Yeah.
And that for me was that ethical, political component
Yeah.
that was messier and
Yes.
not so easily contained or encapsulated in something that you can just put in a gallery.
Yeah. 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 I see this. I see this very much. Like, you are, you are speaking about as well, among many things, about a colonial perspective or decolonial perspective, or at least to take into account in your thinking about how data is produced, how visualization is produced, and even in relation to what's, the case that you are analyzing. So you approach the problem in a highly complex manner, or you try, there's a tendency to really not avoid complexity, but even to embrace complexity, to be aware of it, and then of course, because it's a radical position, you expand and you speak about certain things like colonialism and so forth. And I think that's something that really corresponds with, I think, where design, at least the more interesting to me, and the radical positions in design where they're going. And both you and I are part of that, at the margins, the expansion of how we understand design. And when it happens in these critical margins, the radical margins, relationality is something that we both know. Like, just for example, famous, very well known Arturo Escobar, and there's other people. The relationality is key to that. So that I find is really deeply embedded in your work, which wasn't that, which I didn't find in this English version of critical design.
Yeah.
So it has a much stronger, much more complex grounding that is much more radical, I think. So, and I don't feel also that critical visualization just wants to be manifested in a gallery.
No.
Which that English version of critical design wants to,
Yeah.
So
And there's that sense. And I'm just going to mention one thing, and then I have a question for you.
Yeah.
But I tried to put critical visualization in a gallery.
Yeah.
So the Diagrams of Power book that
Yeah,
I
yeah,
edited is
Yeah.
a result of PhD work and putting these things in gallery. And one of the curators of the gallery told me there's too many things. There's too many things. So I think the curator was used to this notion. It's like there are key pieces that are very enigmatic, or very can hold your attention, or have this power, this one artifact here made by very skilled artists, right? And so a gallery space can have maybe 5, 6 pieces, and if it's a
Yeah.
group show, maybe 1 or 2 more. But for mine, I had like 23 to 25 pieces, and we had like symposium like talks and invites and those types of discussions, and it was much messier. And for me, it's like, if it's too much, that's probably just enough, right? It's like it has to be too much, because it has to spill over. And what happened, what was reported to me, was that people came back because it was too much, right?
Yeah, they came back.
They came back. And it's a free gallery. It's in downtown Toronto. It's accessible by public transportation. So it was people came back, and it's like that's the best thing for me, because you can sit with something and you can see the juxtaposition with other things. And so that diversity, variety, and what is implied in a lot of, maybe almost every piece that was in that show, is the relational aspects that culminated in their production of an artifact, right? And so it's funny how we compare it to this notion of what a critical design originally, or at some point, was something that you could exhibit easily and could work well within an art world, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean that. Yeah, that I think is one of the differences. I didn't mean that critical visualization cannot be manifested in the gallery, but I think it has a much broader application potential, and also, coming from the validation of that knowledge that you've been developing or are developing, happens, I think, in ways which are similar to what critical visualization is. So it's much more networked, it's much more bottom up. It doesn't need the prestige of a gallery to say that's great.
Yeah.
So that's
Right.
a big difference, I think, how it was positioned in the first place. And to me, then critical visualization has much more merit and relevance, because it's embedded very differently in the world.
Exactly. And
as a
the
piece of knowledge, like, yeah.
And the important part happened before the exhibition.
That's right. Yes.
For all the things, this is like uh, a greatest hits, like just like put it together so that people can become acquainted with it in Toronto, right? As opposed to let's make it for that particular piece.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you in terms of when you mentioned relationality, and because of your intervention with the book, relationality for me, I can't help but think of intimacy now, right?
Yeah.
This form of thinking through the quality of relations, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, there's two parts. One is there a difference? And is there a difference between relationality and intimacy? I associate them, but is there a useful difference, or is it very much the same? But what is important about thinking about intimacy right
Yeah.
now? Why is this such a prevalent thought, right?
To me, intimacy is a sort, or is a way is to relate, is a sort of relationality, but it's a particular one. So intimacy, I think, relationality can be distance as well. Relationality can be extractive. The relationality can end up in death, or can in exploitation. But intimacy, the way I was and I am thinking about it, and the way I hope that the book Radical Intimacies would articulate it, is a sort of closeness that is emancipatory, and it has, in my view, at least two dimensions. One is related to a particular type of research, if I use this word, or or maybe investigation. It's difficult to use the right word because it's not only academic, right? And this is where the extra-disciplinary, ideas come in, that we both, I know, like. Looking at something closely and carefully is a nice thought in terms of, investigating and researching, but like this tension that, or this idea, this aim, this goal to come really close to something you want to work with, and this tension is always there in design, so either you have a relationship with the client, either you have a relationship with the social movement. You would have a client-based relationship on one side, and on the other hand, perhaps a truly participatory horizontal engagement. The intimacy can happen in both, in both examples, but the quality is very different. If I'm embedded in a social movement, if I'm accepted by the social movement, which will take time, of course, right? And building of trust, the level of intimacy is completely different. And intimacy then, in such a way, is connected with several other things. And for me, and what we were working with, when with Memefest, and this came gradually in 20 years, we gradually became aware that this is something, and we started articulating it, that intimacy in this case is related to dialogue, as a form of communication that can happen in an anti-dialogic world, right? In a the world that is not only non-dialogic but is anti-dialogic. As so the closest form of communication, dialogue. Then friendship is something very important, and so intimacy in this sense is this, I think, radical concept of how to engage with design, in a broad sense, and it includes other things, that are part of this process of intimacy, or intimacy as a state. So dialogue, collaboration, definitely, how to collaborate, how to learn how to collaborate, friendship, and very often, interestingly, I think pleasure, is something that's very crucial. The really most breakthrough moments in the projects that we were doing with MemeFest, pleasure just was there. We created it. So, I see these things interrelated, and we can now, of course, once you contextualize intimacy, it just becomes, it might have a same or very similar DNA, but it manifests according to a particular situation, according to people, according to a culture, according to a context, right? So it's not a formula. It's this living intimacy, which has its main ethical ideas or goals, but it then becomes something depending where it manifests and how it manifests.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And there's a few things that come up with this notion of friendship, and it's seen as something nice, like it's a nice to have, as opposed to something that is essential.
Yes.
Right. And it's I don't think it's any accident that, like, there's been this sort of rise of the individual, right? This kind of like constant idea that the individual is either self-reliant, or you have to brand yourself as being different. So being different, being individual, we've been receiving messages constantly that this is the thing that is needed for us to be successful, to be happy, to be whatever. And not for nothing, but capitalism gets right in there and provides you the tools for this individualism, right? And the flip side of that is loneliness, is isolation, is all these other things, right? And so friendship, I think, is quite radical in how we kind of start to think of things that might not be associated with friendship. Friendship, we think, is like psychological, it's private, it's serendipitous, and it's something that we don't really talk about in official terms, right? And then when we associate it with design, it's like, what are you talking about? Like a clique? Like, no, a clique is not a scene, not maybe, but not necessarily. But so what is friendship there, right? So I think that's a really sort of radical proposition. And something that is that can be, from personal experience, design can be toxic, right?
Absolutely.
And so I've seen it in schools, I've seen it in studios, and it can be competitive and toxic, and who's the best and who's on top, right? And exclusionary. But so this idea of friendship within design, outside, and especially outside of design, I think is key.
What you're saying now just got me thinking about one thing. Like, friendship usually seems to be, as you said, a private thing. A thing that is not professional, right? It's not something that is part of your job. And I think we started to think about and theorize it and become aware of it because the work that we do with design within MemeFest, it's not really professional and it's not really the job. It's kind of like a calling. And but interestingly also, somehow it is very serious, and it's a mission, and it's something that we work on for decades now. So it's also not just a hobby. It's not just spending your free time. So it's something that it isn't professionalized. It's not a job, but it's also not just spending your free time. And I think, from what you were saying in terms of capitalism dissolving our safety nets and dissolving our, intimacy that isn't just, intimacy that has a longevity and that has trust, and it has really a depth. That seems to be also something that friendship can manifest somehow in between all these spheres that try to attack it and try to dissolve it.
Yeah.
And that I guess is where you and I somehow are able to operate, besides us having jobs, besides having that part of life as well. And that's somehow, now I just realized that for the first time, this in-betweenness in terms of friendship.
And I think, the friendship, and when you were talking, I was reminded that friendship, capitalism is very skilled at co-opting almost anything as the in-betweener. I explain it to my daughter. It's like capitalism is the thing that gets in between everything, ourselves and our own nature. That's basically what capitalism does. And it's parasitic, not symbiotic. It's always extracting from its host until it dies off, and then it moves to something else. And so for me, I'm not going to put friendship as this like sphere that is untouchable by capitalism. But what friendship can do in the meantime is you work within so friendship takes work, right? And friendship takes time, and the friendships that are asymmetrical, you tend to not want anymore. Right? The ones that take more than you receive, right? And or with a friend, you don't want to profit off of a friend, right? So that's a modus operandi of a capitalist relation, right? And so the other aspect is that you're accountable to friends. And we're talking about good friendships, right? Not like frenemies and not the other kinds of friendships, right? But you're accountable. And that was one of the things that I started thinking through with critical visualization. Right? That when you are representing people in this aggregate form, you should be accountable to the people you're representing. Right? And one person I'm a fan of, and I've highlighted her work often, is Margaret Pierce, an indigenous cartographer based in Maine. And so her work has been great in many respects. And one of the ways that it resonates for me is the way that there are these relations that are required, that follow protocol. And within the indigenous communities, there are a variety of protocols of how information is shared, when it can be used, when it can't be used, and by whom. And those are relations that need maintenance. So that's the other part of friendship, relationality, intimacy, is that there is a notion of consent. There's a notion of maintenance. And it's slow. And it's quote unquote costly, right? It's not cheap. Right? And so it requires that kind of attention, right? And that's she embodies for me in many of the works that she's done, that kind of ethics, right? And and it's a friend-like relationship, maybe not friends where it's like you joke about something like
Yeah.
professional sports, or like,
Yeah.
or griping about capitalism, like whatever it is,
Yeah.
over drinks. It's more like friendship otherwise, right? So friendship in other forms,
Yeah.
where there is these notions of accountability, of respect,
Yeah.
of reciprocity, those types of things.
Yeah. 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 So I mean, one thing that comes to mind is like it would be a very it would be a pretty interesting project to look into friendship in design, and how this manifests in different projects or different studios or different radical initiatives, and how much this is actually conscious or articulated and reflected, that's part of it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I want to come back to your chapter and the work that critical visualization more explicitly as you were right. But I have one question before we might delve more explicitly into some of the ideas. Um, so complexity is something that to me was always related to mapping, cartography. I think partly probably, well, to a significant degree, I personally am and was drawn to this way of articulating the world, so mapping, cartography, because it has a potential to somehow deal with complexity. And there's a lot of talk about complexity these days, right? So systems design, systemic design, complexity somehow is on the table, right? When we talk about design. I I wanted to ask you, how do you think we can think about um, complexity in relation to to radical design? What what is it about complexity? What can we do with complexity that enables us to do radical design, or makes it radical in the first place, makes it better, makes it more of a design that has relevance or that does something to the world, that is radical.
Mhm.
So, like, do you have any thoughts on that? What is it about complexity, or how can we use complexity in radical design?
So I can think of two ideas that might respond to that,
Yeah.
notion of complexity. One is to um, to not shy away from complexity, and to almost bathe in complexity,
Yeah.
right? Be comfortable, become more comfortable with complexity. And
Yeah.
one example that comes to mind is bureau d'études,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
so all their um, visualizations, their maps of capitalism are, but for lack of a better term, basically, um, and military industrial complex, and many things, um, they stay complex, and they try to put more things into the map, right? And
Yeah.
it becomes, it you can navigate through it and see little parts of it. You can't really see the whole, right?
Yeah.
You can see little parts here and there.
Yeah.
And but you are used to working within complexity without it um sort of defeating you,
Yeah.
right? And it's being okay. It's almost like being okay with ambiguity. At a certain point with our designs, with my design students, I would say you have to be okay with some ambiguity through the process. If you always want the solution right away, you're cutting yourself short, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and I think there's a similar sort of movement here when you're dealing with things that are so complex, that do it and engage in the complexity, knowing that the thing might be in the details that might come out from that mapping of the complexity. The
Yeah.
the other example for me is iconoclasistas in Buenos
Yes.
Aires. So they deal with very complex issues, but their form of dealing with that complexity is the relational aspect. and
Yeah.
the community aspect of people coming together. So the process of trying to get a handle on complexity, the complexity is engaged with
Yeah.
through meeting, through being together in the same room, through working through the process of mapping and representation and of categorization, of description, of all these different processes. So that is active cognitive work. That
Yeah.
is social work. People have to
Yeah.
negotiate and talk and have dialogue,
Yeah.
even though they're dealing with something that is immensely complex.
Yeah.
But they find the local aspect. They find the stakeholders. They find the pieces that hit the ground, right? Within
Yeah.
that complexity. So these two examples is one where you represent it all, or make that gesture to
Yeah.
representing it all,
Yeah.
and just being okay with it on
Yeah.
a visual basis, on an aesthetic basis. But the other one is through process, through
Yeah.
performance, through the doing,
Yeah.
and through the social work, you
Yeah.
actually work together around a complex issue, and things come out of it. And
Yeah.
whether there is a map at the end that has like, okay, we've done it, we've simplified complexity, and it's, well, once again, that's not the point. I mean, that's like um the goal, but not the goal. The goal
Yeah.
is
That's right. Yeah.
a journey, right?
That's right. Yeah. 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 I guess there's a, at least I feel like that there's a tension, right? In in critical visualization projects, a tension between simplifying complexity for the sake of, function or like impact, or uh, but then also there is an awareness, that there's a trap in this simplification.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of this internal conflict, how to make it legible, how to make it something that people understand and
Yeah.
engage with, but then on the other hand, not to simplify, and and still maintain complexity. And so I don't think, that there's an answer to that, or like, there's like,
And
this is how we resolve it. But
yeah.
from your, it seems to me that, part of your analysis of liquid traces, looks into that as well. So, you're talking about the question of authority of data, right? And you explain, what kind of strategies liquid traces uses in order to maintain this authority.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a tendency within this project, or perhaps I might say within critical visualization, that there's a transparency, that there is not, like, that there, it's not, it's definitely on the opposite side of propaganda, right? So
Yeah.
so it's like, in a way, it's still a left-leaning tradition of developing an argument, right? That there's a set of arguments in the end that are backed up, right? They're backed up by data, by information, by evidence. But it's not only, a rationally built argument, but it has also this aesthetic, artistic side.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you please, I wanted to ask you how do you see that? What are your thoughts on that? Because that's a complex and beautiful tension, all these worlds together in one thing.
The yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy, because on the one end, when things are simplified so much, um they are made to travel quickly and far, right?
Yeah.
So propaganda, and there are examples of maps. I think, who was it? I think it was John Pickles, maybe, who wrote about propaganda and maps. And then you'd see the territory, especially World War II era Europe, and you see the scourge or the octopus of either the USSR, or, well, at that point it was just Russia, but Russia and the or Germany kind of spreading,
Yeah.
right? And it was very simple. It was a map. Everybody recognized the European map, and
Yeah.
everybody saw the octopus
Yeah.
or the gooey thing that was enveloping the blob that was enveloping everybody, and it was like that was the threat. And so they use visualization in this highly rhetorical fashion in order to incite fear, to see something familiar, and then to bring in the monster, right? There's another form like Al Gore. He used this famous hockey stick graph, right, of temperatures
Yeah.
rising, right? And
Yeah.
that was highly simplified, but very complex uh, visualization to make. Like all the resources used in order to come up with how temperatures were over the past millennia. I
Yeah.
mean, people have been recording temperatures on a global level.
Yeah.
What is it, 100 years, 150 years, maybe? But then how do you map something that's 1,000 years,
Yeah.
right? So there's no reliable temperature gauging there. So you have to look at other proxies for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but it gets simplified in order to drive home a point. And so it loses all the construction of it. All the pencil marks have been erased in order to make a very nice line that goes up at the end.
Yeah.
So on the flip side is liquid traces
Yeah.
that stays with the complexity, and it travels much less than a propaganda poster
Yeah.
about the threat of communism,
Yeah.
right? And much less than the hockey stick graph by Al Gore. But when it does, when you do engage with it, you're engaging with how this idea of um, the failure of international agencies to properly safeguard the lives of migrants,
Yeah.
um, it becomes like this complex thing that has to be put together. It can't be just a finger pointing. It has to
Yeah.
be constructed. And
Yeah.
so you see the the different processes involved, the different pieces of data and of evidence that are being put one on top of the other in order to create this case, right?
Yeah.
And so that for me is respects the viewer a lot more. And it's something that you can inspect yourself, right? So you
Yeah.
don't have to take my word for it. You can, this is where the interviews are, this is where the sources are, this is like citation kind
Yeah.
of kind of logic. And yeah, and so those are the two forms that really kind of like stand out for me, between the propaganda, the simplification, and then the other one that kind of shows its own process
Yeah.
of creation.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why that chapter is kind of like is around this designing of facts is because there's this idea that facts are so it seems nowadays more than ever, facts are becoming almost meaningless, right? I have a fact, you have a fact, everybody has a fact, right? And one of the ways that this dashboard visualization with all the complexity in it kind of demonstrates is that facts are designed, they're constructed,
Yeah.
and it's it's about the quality of that construction, right?
Yeah.
How well constructed is it? How much will it withstand other arguments against it,
Yeah.
right? Provided we're talking about within a rational sphere, as opposed to like other kinds of things, right?
That
So
seems to be almost like a condition, right, for critical visualization, for someone to read it and engage with it, that
yeah.
someone is open to that rational argumentation, right?
Hmm. Yeah. And I have to say that that's where I was going. And then I started thinking, okay, so let's not get down into the trap of building a better visualization. Always building a better visualization that's more convincing. And that's why for me, and especially in the article in your book, I try to really think about what came before it and how does it circulate, because
Yeah,
those are equally important,
yeah,
right? So how do you treat the survivor?
yeah,
How do you create a
yeah,
kind of protocol where you respect their humanity and their dignity?
yeah,
How do you build trust with them, right? And then afterwards, how do you use this data, these visualizations? You just put
yeah,
it up there and hope that someone will see it, or do you perform with it?
yeah,
Like, do you push it out into different media? Another
yeah,
project that I've written about is the anti-eviction mapping project in San Francisco.
yeah,
It's an amazing project by the San Francisco Tenants Union. And similarly, they deal with complexity, like a huge amount of complexity around evictions, unlawful evictions of tenants, right?
yeah,
And they have so many maps, so much data, databases in order to help people fight eviction. And in it, um, in my analysis of that, similarly to the one for forensic architecture and liquid
yeah,
traces, there's
yeah,
this idea that you you need to do the work with people.
yeah,
So they have zines, they have murals, they have events, they show up in court
yeah,
with the tenants. So it's all relational.
yeah.
It's not just a map. The maps are one thing, but it's
That's
not
right.
the only thing. Is there's so much more underneath it. And they've made maps that are very simple and that have
Yeah,
been circulated widely on AJ Plus on
yeah,
social media. And
yeah,
they're
yeah,
very compelling. And it's like, this is the rate of evictions.
yeah,
Great. But that is simplified,
yeah,
circulates widely,
yeah,
very quickly. But that's not the one thing. There's an iceberg
yeah,
of relationality
yeah.
underneath it.
I think it's so very meaningful what you're describing and explaining, and perhaps helpful for radical designers who are engaged within their communities, but perhaps they feel that that's part of it, that that's what they're doing, but the lack of language,
Mhm.
still there is the lingering ghost of the artifact, in our discipline,
Oh yeah.
especially when it comes to communication design, so if you don't do that, then that's not design. So I think the combination of concepts of relationality, criticality, visualization, the network, the people that are in there, that makes it visible, literally, it makes it kind of plastic, I can see that, and I can totally relate to that. So I think it's a very helpful articulation, and I think knowing uh, designers who are engaged in such a way with people, with communities, that is something that will be very empowering, or would be very empowering if they would read it, because it totally makes so much sense. It's helpful.
Yeah, and I
So
hope so.
yeah,
One thing when you mentioned communication design and how it might be difficult for some people to get beyond the artifact,
yeah,
a few years ago, I went into the etymology of communication,
uh-huh.
right? And for me, it was like very instructive, and
Yeah,
it was liberating
yeah,
actually,
yeah, yeah,
because communication has been seen as this like again, the signal to noise ratio of
yeah,
like implanting something in someone's head,
yeah,
right? Like the silver bullet.
yeah,
And the better you are at the more successful or the more valuable you are as a designer. When communication is sharing, is being next to each other, communis is the sharing of gifts.
yeah.
So it's like that. And we were talking about friendship, and it's like how
That's right.
weird it is for it to be coupled with design. I was like, well, actually,
That's right.
if you look at the roots of
That's
communication
right.
design, it's a
That's
sharing
right.
of gifts.
But then, you said it beautifully before, capitalism, what it does, it comes in between.
Yeah,
And, the cooptation of design, as a, well, not really cooptation. It was born as such, but, maintained this relationship.
yeah,
Um, it comes in between, of the sharing of gifts,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
but we still call it communication.
Yeah.
On a quick side note, if we would make an analysis of undergraduate communication design degrees, around the world, we would see there's very little teaching about communication actually, in communication design, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think this brings me, speaking about the discipline, this brings me to a point that I'm very interested in. And we mentioned the extradisciplinary before, although you don't mention that in your article, but I know you're fond of, you're interested in it, and it's part of your thinking. You do say, though, not just the artifact, but the messiness, the relationality, and what we were just discussing now. But you also say it demands us to go beyond that disciplinary narrow positioning, right? When, and you particularly speak about data visualization or information design. So you say we have to go beyond the discipline, Can you say something about that?
Um, uh, I find, as an aside, I find this fascinating how there's a close reading and I'm being interrogated on on what I've written, and it's like, and it's both exciting and terrifying at the same time, because it's like, did I say that? No, I did say that, and I have to think about and make it and paraphrase myself in order to maybe tease it out, right?
Yes.
So for me, the messiness, by its own nature, requires difference and diversity. So it's like that's just it. So,
Yeah.
and the messiness is not teleological, right? And so you can't determine what its endpoint is. It's just messy. And so if you are predisposed to engage with the messiness, then of course you're going to go beyond discipline. Of course you're going to go beyond the academy,
Yeah.
right? Because these are both useful, powerful tools and contexts, but they also frame
Yeah.
so decidedly. And if you
Yes.
work within that only, then you are a creature of that framework. And whether it be a discipline or by extension, a school, like a school of
Yeah.
thought, or a university that embodies that or professionalizes that kind of knowledge.
Yeah.
So when you go beyond it, it's because you are being attentive to where the thing goes, where we are going with that particular issue, right?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
so you don't draw these like the flat earth things, like, no, beyond that, that's it. There's
Yeah.
dragons, and then after that, it just falls off, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I can't go there. No,
Yeah.
you're and especially if you have a political commitment to liberation and emancipation.
Yeah.
Like, are you going to have a discipline circumscribe your kind of intervention, or are you going to have your political, ethical, moral
Yeah.
conviction for human emancipation
Yeah.
to guide you?
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. Of course. I mean, if we look how disciplines manifest, um, no wonder we are interested in the extra of the discipline, in the outside, because they are more or less they really are, in these institutions that we call universities largely, they are instrumentalized in a way where, again, capitalism comes in between, the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, or the pursuit of knowledge for social change that is against capitalism. Capitalism comes in between, not 100% and not everywhere, and not all the time, but we can see this happening more and more, not less and less.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's so critical visualization then necessarily can't just exist within the university, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
It can be partly there, or we can partly think about it there, but the boundary is not the university. The boundary is elsewhere, or the expanding boundary.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
And the university is useful.
yes,
It there's an ideal
yeah,
embedded in the university,
that's right.
which
Yeah,
is part of the collegial sort of aspect where it's either consensus or it's democratic.
yeah,
That may be not existent in many contexts,
yeah,
but there are pockets.
yeah,
And frankly, I experience within a very prescribed part, because there are hierarchies within my university,
of course, yes,
but there is a self-management to a certain extent in my university. In my experience in at OCAD University and at York University, there is
yeah,
a self-management to an extent, right?
yeah,
Which I never experienced within the corporate world, right? Never experienced in the corporate world. And so there should be much more of that.
yeah,
Absolutely. That would go against the wave of neoliberalism that's happening in.
yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. And the university is also the school of the institution that champions research, and that
yeah,
research is really useful and can do grave damage, right? So,
yeah,
and that university can create research that is ownable,
yeah, of
can become intellectual property, or it can work and empower communities,
course,
right?
yeah,
One, there's a profit motive. And
yeah,
so
of
as you defund universities more and more, that profit motive becomes more and more of an imperative, right?
course, yeah,
And things that don't turn a profit, like community-based or community-led research,
yeah,
will be harder to put into place and to rationalize within that university. So
yeah,
that's the mix that I'm experiencing within the university. Um, and that's for me why it's also important to not identify with the institution,
yeah,
to
yeah,
work
yeah,
against it, to
yeah,
work outside of it,
yeah,
um, and use the resources, the mechanisms, the power,
yeah,
frankly,
yeah,
and the income,
yeah,
my income,
yeah, yeah,
cash income, my what I live on,
yeah,
as a way of doing things outside of university.
yeah.
It behooves me, right?
I feel the same. I feel the same. If the university is smart, it will know that that's very close to its mission, as it should be. As an institution that benefits the civil society,
Mhm.
that benefits democracy,
Yeah.
and paradoxically, what you were just describing in the end, working outside or even against it, um, that creates insights and knowledge that is the knowledge that we need in this current world.
Yeah.
And paradoxically, again, the universities often say, well, we want to better the world, we want to change the world, we want to benefit the world. We are aware of the environmental catastrophe, of the social injustices, of all that, and we need new approaches, new knowledges. But then there's a tension, because what you were describing um,
Yeah.
is not fostered, and maybe that's how it should be, because if it would be, it would become institutionalized, then it wouldn't be a conflict anymore. And it's the conflict that produces these insights and knowledges that then are, I think, very valuable.
Yeah, yeah. And
So
universities have always been under attack too. That's what,
that's right.
and so I don't feel special in how
Yeah, yeah,
it's like right now of how universities have been attacked, but throughout forever, the universities have
yeah,
been suspected as
yeah,
being like the places where there's rabble rousers, right? Where
yeah, yeah,
there's people that kind of like think differently, and so it's always been sort of
yeah,
this thing. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
You have been talking, in your chapter, about several very detailed concepts, and I think people should read your chapter, to kind of really uh, get to know them, like immutable mobiles or
Mhm.
cascades of inscriptions,
Yeah, yeah.
or navigational practice or interestment, right? So these, I think, are like very, it's important to engage with those concepts to really understand critical visualization.
Yeah.
And so again, I invite the listeners to read that. But I want to ask you, we will continue, our conversations, obviously.
Oliver, you cut off, so I'm not
Okay.
sure if the recording kept it. So if you want to go back to as when you started with the list of terms, because
That's right.
it'll be a hard edit if you
Of
don't do
course.
that part. Okay.
Yeah. So you described certain concepts, in your chapter very precisely, like immutable mobiles, cascades of inscriptions, navigational practice, and interestment.
Mhm.
So, these are very concisely described concepts that are part of critical visualization.
Yeah.
And you found them and you saw them in liquid traces.
Yeah.
And I think in detail, our listeners should read your words, should delve into it precisely by reading the chapter. But I wanna ask, as we're slowly perhaps winding towards the end, and we'll definitely, obviously, continue our conversations. But one thing I'm interested, what is it about critical visualization that you're at the moment interested in, and what do you think, where should we go with it? Because you have with me a a soulmate into what you're researching, and I'm very interested. Um, what do you think, as someone who really did the work? Where should we go? What is it that we need to look in, and what should we do in order to advance that knowledge of critical visualization?
So the terms that you listed are useful tools that
Yeah,
I borrowed from Latour, from Bruno Latour,
yeah, yeah,
when describing the basically power
yeah,
in socio-technical networks,
yeah,
right? So when it comes to mutable mobiles and interrezement and cascade of inscriptions, those are specific concepts on how information, the qualities of how information can be passed along, or the material conditions of information and representations of knowledge um, can be passed from one actor to another, one person to another.
yeah,
Um, and then how um, people get brought into
yeah,
power relations with other people and with other organizations in order to do something, right?
yeah,
So it's all about relationality through and through.
yeah,
And if we think of critical visualization as being an investigation and an acknowledgement that that is the bedrock of a design practice, then how do we understand current issues of, especially when I was writing this,
yeah,
I was getting bit by bit introduced to notions of decoloniality,
yeah,
right? And I was not prepared to incorporate decolonialism within this framework, even though I feel it's very much aligned, right?
yeah,
Especially in its goal of understanding power
yeah,
for the purposes of emancipatory politics, right?
yeah,
Um, so one of the part of the trajectory for me is to think about decoloniality. So what is decoloniality, right? Is to understand basically the powers of colonialism, historical and present, in making the whole world one world. And
yeah,
that one world is white, capitalist, patriarchal. right?
Yeah.
And so how do we work with that idea? And how do we combat that? And I take to heart one of the key ideas by an Indigenous scholar here in Canada, Eve Tuck, who thinks about decoloniality beyond the metaphor of decoloniality. It's not like everything's colonial, everything, we should undo this general relationship of decolonial, of colonization. For her, it's very specific as giving land back,
Yeah.
as sovereignty,
Yeah.
right? As respecting treaties,
Yeah.
right? Like all those things have been um, are immensely important for us to work through what colonization has done, right?
Yeah.
And we can think of oppressive structures that might not fit neatly into colonialism, but in my context, North America, Central America, South America, our history is through and through
Yeah.
written through colonialism, right?
Yeah.
And taking that one step further, and you've already mentioned it, you kind of like pre pre preempted my trajectory is
Yeah.
in thinking about the pluriverse, right?
Yeah.
And for me, the pluriverse is a great framework to think through critical visualization, especially because for me, what I'm understanding of pluriversal thought is the idea that against this one world,
Yeah.
this one worlding,
Yeah. Yeah.
right, of
Yeah.
white, Eurocentric, capitalist, patriarchal society, then there are other worlds.
Yeah.
What if we start thinking that there are multiple worlds, and these worlds are onto-epistemological worlds, right?
Yeah.
They're about knowledge, they're about communication, they're about culture, and also about relations, right?
Yes.
And so, and they're not beside each other, they're always on top of each other. They're not
Yeah.
bubbles,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're like prisms on top of each other, right?
Yeah.
That contain
Yeah.
what we call reality, right? And
Yeah.
so to understand that is I think a furthering of what the representation of information
Yeah.
through a thought of relationality, where
Yeah.
it can go. Like how do we represent
Yeah.
forms of knowledge
Yeah.
that help decolonization?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we represent knowledge and create this knowledge and
Yeah.
circulate this knowledge in order to um, promote a pluriversal outlook, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. As I think also that kind of research, decolonization has to take capitalism into account.
Mhm.
So, decolonizing from capitalism, which is male, white, patriarchal. And on that note, there's a project for us. It's
Yeah.
fascinating, that is fascinating. It sounds as a difficult,
Oh,
very difficult task, but I would love to talk to you more about that,
yeah,
and how to do something like that as a research, as a intervention project
yeah,
in the future.
absolutely.
So I would like to thank you, Patricio. It was, a pleasure, and it was great talking to you. It felt like, it was long due, to do that.
Yeah.
And let's talk soon again. There's so much more to talk about and to make plans.
Yeah, and I appreciate this kind of very detailed kind of discussion. I crave it. I yearn for it.
Yeah.
And I think we talked for the first time a year or so
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
And then we talked last week prepping for
That's right.
this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, I think I like this rhythm a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
like a few weeks or a month or so so to keep the motor running, because I think there's lots of ground, and I love the community that you're you're building and you're
Yeah.
maintaining, right?
Yeah.
Through the publication of the book and
Yeah.
through sharing and hosting these types of discussions. I think it's absolutely great.
Thank you so much. I can only echo what you're saying, you know. So I also am craving this kind of, you know, conversation and closeness and exchange and dialogue. And you know, let's just do it. You know, we'll talk soon and we'll just do it. So, you know, it's great. You know, that is really, I think, a beautiful thing of our collaboration through this book.
Yeah.
That, you know, after a while it was published, now we're saying, okay, we have to do something else together and intensively in the future. So that's a beautiful thing.
Great. Thanks, Oliver.
Thank you too. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
We'll talk soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is a production of MemeFest and Intellect, publisher of Original Thinking. It is a celebration of our collaboration and Intellect's 40th anniversary. The podcast is produced in Naarm, also known by its colonial name Melbourne. We would like to pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. The music at the start and end of each episode is by the band Bait from Boona in Victoria, with members Michael McGuinness and Malachi Doyle. You can find them on Bandcamp. Check them out. Thanks. Until our next episode, take care.